Aaron Kowalski. Raise your hand, Aaron. Aaron, he's... I can get this part over with quickly. They've all been living with type 1 diabetes. So to think about people that developed type 1 and then went in the field. And Aaron is the top guy, the chief medical and chief executive officer of the JDRF. And how long you been there, Aaron?
19 years.
19 years. So he has appropriately gone up the ranks, and I have a lot of respect for JDRF for getting Aaron and promoting him, and he's just a great face of the organization, mainly because he puts it up on Facebook all the time when he's running. Leslie Island, she is a professor in Omaha, Nebraska. She's got type 1, she's got 2 kids. She's been in a lot of our video programs, and her claim to fame, at least for a while, has been remote learning and video visits during COVID. But she's tired of talking about that. We're going to skip it on this. And then Justin Gregory, he's just an amazing guy. He's got 4 kids, was an Air Force fighter pilot, got type 1, and now he's a pediatric endocrinologist and went into some heavy duty research area, shares a lot of that with Jeremy. So Jeremy, take it away.
All right, well, I am back. Thanks to my panelists for joining me. And I think the other important part of your introduction is that you guys are all on the same Peloton team together, right? Yeah. Can you tell us about that? I mean, in regards to my weight loss talk.
I'll start this story. So during the pandemic, my wife, who's a big marathon runner, had an injury, and she's like, I got to find something to do. And a neighbor down the street was putting their Peloton up for sale. And no kidding, just wheeled it down the street to our house. And she started riding it, and I used to be a serious road cyclist, and I kind of rolled my eyes at the idea of Peloton. I thought it was basically glorified aerobics, and so I just kind of rolled my eyes and sat and felt sorry for myself for the first few months of the pandemic. But then I found out that my 2 friends here were on, and I'll let them jump in. But long story short, I got addicted to it because every Wednesday morning, Leslie and I, hey, what are you doing tomorrow morning? And during the pandemic, I had this little clip where I could put my phone and I just text. And that was about as much socialization as I did for a while. And that was a lifeline for me. So, yeah.
It's been almost 3 years that we've been pretty consistently riding together.
Mm-hmm. Peloton together.
From Omaha and Nashville. Yeah.
All right, well, we got a lot to talk through. Like, this is vaguely called research and kind of breakthroughs in type 1 diabetes. So a lot of different areas. So we're going to cover, these broad themes that Steve and I kind of laid out in the beginning, but technology, potentially other medications besides insulin, that's another category, new immunotherapies, medications for type 1 diabetes, immune-related, and then, what I'll call cellular replacement, stem cells or beta cell replacement, all those kind of categories. So I think, just starting with technology and a little bit of the here and now, we can talk about, CGM sensors that you guys are using, the new things on the block, G7, experiences with like Libre, like anything that you guys want to talk about in that regard. I think there's probably a lot of questions about the G7 and that rollout. I don't know if anybody wants to start there, maybe.
I mean, so I have quite a bit of experience with the G7, primarily in my type 2 patients and a few of my type 1s on multiple daily injections, but most of my patients are just anxiously awaiting their hybrid closed loop system, either with the Omnipod 5 or Control-IQ, to become amenable with the G7. And so I'm hopeful. I think there's been some delays, but it seems like that actually may happen in the next few months.
Yeah,
the calendar year.
It's been my experience too that it's obviously a good system. It's that's a 30-minute warm up instead of 2 hours. And again, here we are now kind of complaining about the 2 hours. But that 30 minutes actually it's a nice change. And then having everything in one device, like the sensor and the transmitter, so you don't have the second prescription. You're always losing one or the other. So that's nice, and it's definitely smaller. But it doesn't work with any of the pumps yet, with the Omnipod and the Control-IQ, so we're kind of waiting for that.
Well, one question I get a lot in clinic, I don't think people understand, well, why these people that are doing multiple daily injections get to have it, and not people with pumps? And The reason is that anytime you have a new addition to, say, a insulin pump that has to be approved by the FDA, and you make a significant change to it, you need to show that it's safe and efficacious, and there's a process to doing that. So it's one thing to say, hey, this new CGM is not changing Lantus or Humalog, but it does when you're using a new device to control, say, automated insulin delivery. So I've tried to explain that to my patients. Hey, it's coming, probably. It's just going to take a few months to get there.
Jeremy, I'll just add one thing here from our perspective at JDRF. A big focus of ours over the years has been automated insulin delivery, and I'm proud that each one of these pumps has technology that we funded in them. But the thing that makes me crazy right now is this problem of integration of technology. So folks who raise their hand with Loop, JDRF actually funded a not-for-profit company called Tidepool to bring Loop through the FDA. And it's approved. It's approved, but we can't use it. And you would say, well, why is that? And I think it's incredibly short-sighted. I know the company people are here, and I've said this directly to them, that the companies are trying to control like the whole kit and caboodle versus like focusing on what they do best. And I'm a big believer that more options for people are better, and picking which sensor, which pump, and then ultimately which algorithm is best is where we need to be. So I think what's going to happen in the future, and it'll be very interesting when we come back next year or in 2 years, when some of these companies just start to say, we're going to work with apps on the cell phone like Loop. Because ultimately that, I always joke that my wife drives a 2017 Volvo and I drive a 2021 Chevy Bolt, and her mapping system is still Volvo's. Oh. And it looks like Pac-Man from 1980. Mm-hmm. And I use, of course, I have Waze, I have Google Maps. The software is different than the hardware. And I think what's got to happen here quickly is you got to start plugging and playing with these devices. And that's a big focus of ours. And I think somebody's going to start to do it, and everybody's going to have to get on board there.
Yeah.
I think one thing that's improved that was previously a barrier for us is after it gets FDA approved, getting the payers to then start covering it. But that's really sped up. I think the G7 was approved by the FDA in end of December, and CMS already approved it in March, which is a much faster process than it used to be. So, and I think a lot of private insurers have been covering the G7 for months and months now. So I'm encouraged at that, increase in speed.
It's kind of on the same topic, but I would say one kind of silver lining of COVID is it forced all these doctors' offices, ours included at UCSD, to start actually using kind of telehealth care, and particularly for people with diabetes, finally figuring out how to actually download people's CGMs remotely so that we can see that information when we see people remotely. But also just now, before I go see a patient, their CGM data is all there, their pump data is all there. And before COVID, it was do you still have the right wires? And if you don't have it, you couldn't download it. So it's been super helpful to see people's information. And it's just, I don't know how to practice diabetes care, type 1 care without that CGM information. Because if you don't have that, then it's you got 3 finger sticks from the last month or something. So that's been a huge benefit of having that data, basically.
Yeah. But I think that also empowers people that relied on patients figuring it out and downloading those apps and getting connected, because before they were very reliant on their clinicians and the clinics. And so it's nice to see, people are getting the app and then they're starting to look at their data, which they weren't before. So it's an additional benefit.
Yeah.
Just the one last thing, because now I love these topics. They're so interesting. What we could be doing better, because at least for us at JDRF, there's kind of 2 big things that we're trying to do is get smaller and interoperable, and then remove meal boluses. Those are the big things for us. But everybody's talking about AI, Bill, you put up the Chat GPT and all this machine learning stuff. It makes me bananas right now that we don't use the data that we have in these pumps to dial in basal rates, correction factors, and insulin to carb ratios. Every one of these math people who build these algorithms can do this with your data with like 2 weeks of data. Yet the pumps aren't doing it yet. It makes me absolutely nuts. And I think that's another huge opportunity is to not only get us, the people with diabetes, to get better data, but also the physicians. Like when you come into the office, like, hey, these basal rates aren't right. It's not like fuzzy eyeballing it. It's computers learning it and telling you what it should be. And it's completely possible, but we're not doing it yet.
Well, we agree. So, we're talking about these systems, and again, hopefully everybody's like, knows what they are. It's been available to them. We talked about the Omnipod 5, fantastic system, Tandem Control IQ, also amazing. I know people on this panel are on these systems. And then the new kid is the iLet. And so have you guys had any clinical experience yet using it or things that you want to share with the group?
We haven't yet, and I think some of that's they're just expanding. They're a growing company. They're moving into new parts of the country where they'll have people to support it. So we haven't gotten there yet in Nashville, but other parts of the country have.
Yeah, I think it's still limited to centers that did their clinical trials. So I know for like Nebraska and Iowa, we don't have a rep for our region yet. I think they may, hopefully the next month or so, virtually train our pump trainers. And so I'm hopeful that my patients could get it, hopefully by the end of the calendar year.
Yeah, so, we actually were one of the centers here at UCSD, and our experiences with it, which I think was similar to a lot of the investigators, was that the pump really, it works well, but we all kind of believed when we started it that the people that were going to do the best with the system were going to be people that were already on pumps. They knew how to use pumps and change infusion sets and things like that. But what we actually found is the people that did the best were people typically actually on injections, and for lack of a better word, people that just didn't want to deal with their diabetes. Mm-hmm. And that the pump could kind of do good enough without them really having to interact with it. People that were already on Tandem Control IQ, because I don't think Omnipod 5 was available when we were doing this, they didn't like it as much because you couldn't interact with it as much. Their control might actually not have been as good, which was interesting to us. So it's not to say that you shouldn't try it if you're already on one of these systems, but it might have a niche, in rural areas, for example, where it's because one of the benefits of this pump, it's a lot easier to get people started on it. You don't have to enter carb ratios and things like that to just make these pumps more accessible. Use this pump. If you're on shots, we can get your A1C down into the 7 range without you having to do much. So it's an interesting addition to the market. And right now it's with insulin only, and the plan was always to add glucagon to it. So it's a dual hormone pump. And that remains to be seen if that'll come to fruition, but just kind of another interesting option that literally just popped up.
I think a recent development is that these control algorithms are getting better at recognizing, without you telling it, hey, I'm eating, that you're switching into meal absorption mode, right? Like it said, okay, even though you didn't tell me you just had breakfast, your glucose looks like you just had breakfast. And what's happening there is it modulates the control algorithm to say, I'm not going to be in sort of overnight mode. I'm going to be in aggressive mode, even if you didn't tell me. And that's been a big component of Medtronic coming out with the 780. It's clearly a big part of Beta Bionics. And so I think that's probably what we're going to see in the next 2 or 3 years is all of these algorithms are going to switch to be able to say, yeah, would it be good to bolus before? That's going to, until insulin's really, really fast, it's probably going to be the case. But do you pay as big of a price for not bolusing before as you used to, say, 2 or 3 years ago? I think the difference is going to get slim. I think that's what we're about to see.
So one of the cool things about this pump, and I think that we're moving this direction, is that when you do eat and you want to tell what you're eating, you just say, I'm eating a typical amount for this time of day, a little bit more than usual or a little bit less. So moving away from, I just admitted to all of you, I don't count carbs. And a lot of us don't. But, and certainly people without diabetes don't count carbs. It's just not something that we do. But we can all tell something that we're eating, and we know what a typical amount is, or a little bit more, a little bit less. So moving to more kind of qualitative eating rather than this kind of carb counting, and then, what did you do wrong if you didn't count your carbs right? So I also just wanted to tell everybody that I've been on all these systems, and right now I'm actually on shots, and I've been doing that for the last couple months, actually taking basal insulin and then doing inhaled insulin with meals. And so just saying again that there's no wrong way to do this. With all this technology evolving, it's fantastic. But if you want to take a pump break, you certainly can. And actually, there's some value in that. Learning how to convert back and forth from a pump, because I can't tell you the patients that I've had that their pump's broken and they're just like, they don't know what to do with their diabetes. So all these options are available. The technology is going to keep getting better. I will get back on a pump, but just trying the shots right now and whatever works for you guys.
Yeah, I'll say, Jeremy, I think a lot of people don't appreciate that you can add stuff on top of your pump. Like I always have a Frez on me. I'm on Control-IQ, always have a Frez on me. When I was flying out here yesterday, I got a 350 blood sugar for like no apparent reason. Could not bolus that thing down. Freza, right back to 140. And that's where I think the removal of the bolus may be with some of these things like semaglutide or using an Afrezza for a bolus instead of the bolus feature on the pump. And most people just don't think it. They're like, wait, you do both? And I'm like, yeah, my doctor split up the prescription. I get liquid insulin and I get inhaled insulin. It's just another tool in the toolbox.
I do the same.
Yeah.
One thing I would say about the iLet is that, I think there's huge value for this for people who are managed by a primary care provider, because I think this is like just such a low ask on the clinician. But I think there's a lot of people that struggle with health literacy and numeracy. Diabetes has, there's so many numbers and ratios, and this could be a great system. But I also think there are people on current systems like Omnipod 5 and Control-IQ that we think they're doing well from a metrics perspective, but really have a high degree of diabetes distress and are looking for the ability just to offload something onto a system. I had a patient in clinic just a few days ago, just this past week, saying, you know what I think my biggest problem is with Control-IQ? I think it's me. I'm the problem because I think I know more than the algorithm, and I'm like, no, I need way more than that, or I need less than that, and then it comes back to bite me a few hours later. And I think if I just remove myself from the equation, I think things would go a lot more smoothly. And I think what she was hearing me say about this new system, she was really interested.
At first I thought you said it was mean. I was like, oh, I want to hear about this mean pump. So I think, we'll kind of leave technology now, but like just listening, you can just hear how like rapidly this is changing. And again, it wasn't that long ago that we didn't have CGM. Another thing that's happening is it's just easier for people to get insurance and things like that. When I first started talking about CGM, I don't know, 10 plus years, whatever, at TCOYD, at talks like this, people were just mad, like yelling at me. I was talking about like the benefits of CGM, and I got one, isn't this great? And they couldn't get it, and they were just angry. Especially went to Hawaii, and Hawaii was way behind with their insurance plan there, and people just couldn't get it. So thankfully, that's becoming much less of an issue, and now actually people with type 2 are kind of like being able to get onto it. So it's all changing. So technology is great, it's happening. So next topic, which is one that I'm very passionate about, I know Justin is too, is this idea of other medications for people with type 1 to control blood sugars, let's say. So Justin, maybe just start like with why you think this is even worthwhile. Because I think that the kind of mantra has always been type 1s, you don't make insulin, so you just give them insulin and that takes care of everything.
Yeah, I think some of that's a legacy of probably the most important study that's been done in my lifetime, which was the diabetes complications and control trial. And so you might have even been participants in that study. And they reported in 1993 that if you aggressively try to control glucose, if you try to get glucose down, you're going to drastically improve the rates of a lot of the complications of type 1 diabetes. And I think a legacy of that was, well, if you can fix high blood sugar, you're done. There's nothing more to do. And I think sort of the generation that came up in that era, that's been their focus, is how do we get A1C down? But there's problems with just using insulin as the only therapy. And one has to do with the fact that our bodies don't put insulin into the fat tissue first. Our bodies secrete insulin, and the first place that insulin goes is to the liver. And there's a reason, we'll talk about this later today, there's a reason why it's designed that way, to go to the liver first. You don't want to have too much insulin going around and hitting muscle. There's some consequences to that. A lot of the drugs that are being developed that are so beneficial in type 2 diabetes probably have some very real benefits in type 1, but because I think so much of the US market is type 2, there's not a lot of the same market incentives to develop those drugs and to test them for efficacy in type 1. And that's been a big concern of both of ours. So that's why I think we're in the situation we are. And part of what, I think you and I both want to do in our research is try to say, hey, can we derive some of the benefits of adding these drugs onto insulin therapy for not just reducing high blood sugar, but things like glucose variability, weight gain, insulin resistance, and other things.
So do you guys, Leslie or Justin, you use these in your practice? You prescribe GLP-1s, your type 1s, or?
I've been using a lot of GLP-1s, more so than SGLT2s, and people do really well.
And GLP-1s like Ozempic, sorry.
I usually try Ozempic, and I will code for diabetes with insulin resistance, which is not, which is true. And then so I'll drop sort of a two visit diagnosis and code the Ozempic for the insulin resistance. But then sometimes I'll try Wegovy or a drug specific for obesity, but for a lot of plans, weight loss drugs are a plan exclusion. And so I tend to try Ozempic first and hope that it slides through.
Right.
Otherwise, I try Wegovy.
And it's, my experience with prescribing these for type 1s is sometimes it just goes through. I always do the
Right.
insulin resistance thing also, because maybe somebody who's coding this on the other side just sees that and thinks type 2 and it goes through. Sometimes it gets denied and you can push back with the prior auth, and sometimes it's just like a hard no. And it's really hard to kind of tease out when that will happen. But you guys should be empowered to at least know about these medications and ask. Justin's doing a whole talk on these, and talking about the effects, the side effects, all of that. Because as I said, and I think in our opening talk, I'm tired of type 2s getting all the good stuff. And, I think these drugs do work for type 1s, and we need to be using them more.
It's a little bit different of a dynamic in pediatrics. And the reason that I say that is because especially with adolescents, you're dealing at a really challenging time when adolescents are trying to take more and more of the responsibility of type 1 onto themselves, and a lot of times not doing that very successfully. And that's part of the promise, I think, of closed loop. But one of the challenges of saying, okay, to a teenager, hey, you've got to take your insulin. I'm going to give you one more thing to do. And so part of what we're starting to think about is how can you derive the benefit of these medicines without increasing what's already a burdensome condition to live with. And one of the things that I'm excited about is this idea of co-formulating some of these medicines to go with insulin. So you're not asking someone to take another medicine. You're co-formulating a medicine, say, that some of you may take, called Similan, which slows down how quickly glucose is absorbed. It pushes down glucagon, which is too high when you have type 1 diabetes and you eat a meal. So the idea there is can we manipulate this medicine that you're already taking by adding on different compounds that then would complement what a hybrid closed loop system or even a fully closed loop system is trying to do. So that's where I hope the market and the research heads in the next decade.
Yeah, and I think that will happen. So I do see a day where it's going to be, yes, let's adjust your insulin, and then every kind of visit will say, are there other medicines that we should, think about? So leaving that topic behind for now, and again, Justin's doing a breakout.
Can I just make one more comment? Yeah, from our perspective, we've been really funding a lot of work in this space to do a couple things. One is show that they work in type 1 people, but also to drive the coverage issues and also get the companies to get type 1 labels. It's interesting you mentioned the SGLTs. So for folks who don't know, there's kind of two, the GLPs we call them, that affect how your beta cells make insulin and glucagon and how you're hungry. The other ones just cause you to pee out extra sugar. So Steve showed his pee kit. It lowers what we call your renal threshold. The challenge with these drugs in type 1 people is this phenomenon called euglycemic DKA, where you get DKA at a normal blood sugar. And some people don't understand that it's not high blood sugar that causes DKA, it's low insulin that causes DKA. But the interesting thing that's happening here is we've been trying to get companies to focus on ketone sensing. And Abbott has announced that in their Libre, they're going to have a continuous ketone sensor. So that could really open up the door for the companies to get interested in type 1 because it reduced the risk of diabetic ketoacidosis with a normal blood sugar. And for us, from a research perspective, one of the biggest, we talk about the metabolic, the A1C benefit, but the complications reducing benefits of these drugs are very, very stunning. reduced progression to end-stage renal disease, incredible cardiovascular benefits. So, for us to have another tool in the toolbox that could maybe help with your A1C, maybe help with your weight, but also reduce risk of complications progression is a big deal. And I can tell you, we're very focused on trying to keep the companies interested and get approvals for type 1 people. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to jump to this kind of broad topic of cell replacement. So you guys, this is always in the lay press. There was a New York Times article a while ago too, type 1 diabetes has been cured in this person. And so I think what this ends up happening is that patients will come to see me and they'll say things kind of like, I want some of those stem cells. It's like this vague concept of like stem cells are doing something good in diabetes and like I want them, but I don't know what's happening. So Aaron, maybe like break us down of what giving beta cells back to somebody looks like, different ways of doing that. Where are we at?
Yeah, I'm smiling because I remember the first time I did this conference, my title was Curing Type 1, and I had a lot of folks like this audience, and they're like, we hate you, like there'll never be a cure. So why, I'll just take a very quick, for folks who haven't heard me give this spiel before, why did we think there was a cure right around the corner, and then what's going on right now? And the short version is, we've been able to cure type 1 diabetes for over 20 years with islet transplantation. Islet transplantation, somebody dies, they donate their organs to medicine, they harvest, in this case, pancreases, they chop them up, they take out what are called the islets, so those are the beta cells, but other cells as well, and they inject them into the person's a vein in their leg, and they end up settling in their liver, these cells. If you meet these people, they will tell you flat out they're cured. And I've met a number of them. I see Marjorie, who's been on our board, has met these folks. Their A1Cs are normalized. They don't take insulin. They had, many of them had severe hypoglycemia problems, and they don't. They have to take immunosuppressants to keep these islets going. But the average lifespan for these islets is over a decade. In fact, I was with the guy from Edmonton, James Shapiro, and he has patients 20 years off insulin. So you'd say, well, how are we still here talking about this? It's not scalable. It's not scalable. We have 1.4 million Americans with type 1 diabetes. We've done 5,000 islet transplants over the last 20 years. So this is where, it kind of builds up to this point. So, kind of two big problems that we've been trying to solve for. One is, can you make enough cells for everybody? 40,000 people diagnosed every year, so you got to have enough cells. And then, do you need immunosuppressants? Can you get rid of them? Well, the punchline that everybody's been hearing in the news lately, and the team at Vertex is here, you can talk to them, is Vertex is doing a trial. They've released some data, and in each of the patients that are in this trial, the cells are making insulin, and they're stem cell-derived islets, not what we would call cadaveric islets. So this comes out of research that JDRF and others, NIH funded, going back to the late 90s at Harvard, where they took stem cells and grew them up to insulin-producing cells. And you can, once you have a stem cell, you can make a gazillion of these. So the supply and demand issue then goes away, and this is where Vertex is. But the question is, will it work? Steve said, we've cured 1 million mice, we've never cured people. You've probably seen the New York Times or Good Morning America, the first guy who was in this trial, a mailman from Boston with severe hypoglycemia problems. He's coming up on 2 years off insulin with a normal A1C. 5 points, low fives, 99.9% time in range, and everybody else is making insulin. So that just says then these cells can work, but they're on immunosuppressants. So this is the big focus of ours at JDRF is how broadly can you make this accessible and how do you take away the immunosuppression? Vertex just announced a week or two ago, you can ask them, that they are doing an encapsulated version of the cells. I know you worked on the ViaCyte, they acquired ViaCyte. It's probably a little harder, but that would not require immunosuppression. And then we're funding a lot of work on, for example, gene editing of these cells, so you can inject them without immunosuppressants. But maybe the last thing I'll say about this is, before questions, is it's really interesting to me, kind of this first step. I was with the team from Vertex here in San Diego at the ADA meeting, and I said, how many people out there with type 1 are on immunosuppressants already because they've had kidney failure? And it's about 10,000 people is what they estimate. The line of sight for a cure for these folks is here. I mean, if this trial pans out, you could see this, an immunosuppression-based curative cell therapy in the very near future, which is really amazing. And then, for me, and I think we have a number of legends, I'm proud to be a legend here, and folks who've lived with diabetes a long time, the big next question is, would you do it? So the folks at Vertex flat out asked me when I was in Boston, they said, would you do this? I said, I don't know. I got to think about that. And I went home and I said to my wife, I was just blown away by what they were doing. I mean, absolutely blown away. And I said to my wife, I think I would do it. And she goes, no, you don't want immunosuppressants. And I'm like, I kind of don't want diabetes. And, if you talk to these islet recipients, we actually have a whole pancreas recipient on our research committee right now. And I was sitting and asking about being on immunosuppressants and what it's like and what would you do? He goes, I would never, ever go back. So one of the big things for us at JDRF right now is actually advocating for broader access to these clinical trials. And ultimately, I firmly believe that any adult with type 1 diabetes in the United States, they and their doctors should have the decision to make that decision. Do I want to take immunosuppressants or not the FDA. Because right now they're limiting it. So it's an amazing time. And I know everybody's heard cures are around the corner. My brother was diagnosed in 77, so we've been doing this almost 50 years as well. But I firmly believe I'll take off my pump. I don't believe it's if, it's only a matter of when. And our goal is to make that happen as quickly as possible.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, yeah, this is a super exciting area for sure. And the nice thing about beta cells is that they actually don't need to be in the pancreas. They just need to be able to kind of sense what the blood sugar is, secrete insulin. So as Aaron was saying, that opens the door for when we give people back the cells, we don't have to do a big surgery necessarily and put them in the pancreas. A lot of this work with what Aaron was calling encapsulation is, can we put these cells in a little device and maybe even implant them under the skin? And so the idea with these devices is that the blood sugar and the insulin can kind of freely be exchanged, but if the immune cells can't get in and kill the beta cells, then you might not need immunosuppression. So this is kind of like, the holy grail, I suppose, of, doing these types of, implants. I will say that this company Vertex did buy it ViaCyte, and we were the first in the world to do one of these implants about 10 years ago now. We did it in one of a patient of mine. So, this takes time, but it actually is coming, and there's been some, major breakthroughs. So, I'm optimistic for this area for sure. So thank you for that, Aaron. So I think leaving that behind a little bit and talking specifically more about immunotherapies, and Justin and I are going to talk about this tomorrow, but I think I mentioned earlier that we have our first ever approved drug, an immunotherapy that does something in type 1 diabetes, actually delays the progression of onset of type 1. So maybe Justin, talk to us a little bit about what that is and how you see that evolving.
Well, it's been a long road. I think many of you have been participants in a group of studies called TrialNet, and an early goal of TrialNet was to identify people who are at increased risk of developing type 1 diabetes, and the way that you identify those individuals is by measuring antibodies in the body that are being directed against the part of the pancreas that makes insulin, the beta cells. And what TrialNet found a while ago is that if you have 2 of the 5 antibodies that they measured, provided you live long enough, you're going to eventually develop what we have begun to call stage 3 type 1 diabetes. And the thing to know about stage 3 type 1 diabetes is you're having symptoms and you need insulin. And so early on, they sort of really identified who is at risk of developing it. And through a number of studies for over the past 15 years or so, they had really a lot of disappointing trials where they would use these type of medicines that would modulate the immune system. And because, kind of like Aaron said, we can cure type 1 diabetes. We give someone a medicine called cyclosporin, and it would, take the immune response away, but it puts that person at risk of all the complications of suppressing your immune system. That's not a good trade-off normally. So the idea is that can you develop an immune therapy that would say, hey, immune system, simmer down on the beta cells and let's just fight off other things. And so a study called TN10 was done in TrialNet, and it was the first to show that this new medicine called teplizumab, actually it's not a new medicine, it's a medicine that's been around that just never found a home. But they did this trial, and the top line is that in people who had gotten teplizumab, and now it's being marketed as Tzield, if you were on that medication, on average, from the time you got your teplizumab infusion until the time you developed stage 3 type 1 diabetes and needed insulin was about 4 to 5 years. And by comparison, the group that got placebo, they needed insulin in about 2 years. So what you're talking about is lengthening the amount of time to needing insulin by about 2 to 3 years on average. Some people do much better than that. Some people don't do well. And so we'll talk more about it tomorrow, but I think it heralds the new era. I call it the immunotherapy era of type 1 diabetes therapy. Because what I suspect is we'll find that it not only has some benefit in these individuals who have stage 2. These are people who are just beginning to have high blood sugar, but they don't have any symptoms yet because they still have insulin-producing beta cells in the pancreas. And I think we've established that there's benefit to those people. But what I'm hoping we'll find is that if you catch someone who's just developed what we call stage 3 type 1 diabetes, this is how many of us with type 1 diabetes learned that we had type 1 diabetes. We were peeing a lot or thirsty. There may be some benefit for those individuals. And so I think we as endocrinologists are not used to using those medicines, and we're going to need to get used to using them soon. And moreover, this is kind of the ground floor. I think that the future will show us that we'll be able to figure out for whom this particular therapy will most benefit, or for this other person, can we combine immunotherapies? Can we combine immunotherapy with metabolic therapy? And so I think over the next 10 to 20 years, the field's going to go in the direction of, one, can you delay the amount of time it takes to need insulin? And two, can you not only, once you do take insulin, can you preserve enough beta cells to lengthen the honeymoon period, this time where you don't need that much insulin, you just need a little bit, but the rest of your cells can help out. And so I think that it's an exciting time because of this recent development.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think, what this drug is doing is, again, reminding people that type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease, and it's about time we have something that actually targets the immune system. And type 1 diabetes in this regard is actually way behind some of these other autoimmune disorders, rheumatoid arthritis. I always make the joke, you can't turn on the TV without thinking you have mild to moderate, ulcerative colitis, or, because there's always some new drug. And now we finally have, something that can help with type 1s. So something that's been proven to delay the onset, and like Justin was saying, it's probably not very far off, that every type 1, when they're diagnosed, it's usually DKA, they could potentially get this drug to preserve the amount of insulin that they're producing, which is fantastic. And then the next studies will build on that, adding another medication, et cetera. So, and type 1 diabetes is tough. People ask, why does it take so long? Well, there's some reasons. I mean, one, we can't really look into the pancreas and see how many beta cells are there. It's very difficult. You can't, quantify it. You can't biopsy the pancreas. That's unlike our ulcerative colitis friends that can do, colonoscopies, which granted aren't fun, but you can still do biopsies and get information on what's going on there. It's a big black box in the pancreas. And the other thing is when your beta cells die, they generally just don't come back. So a lot of this death that's happening of the beta cells is happening when people don't even know it before they get type 1. So we just don't know this is happening. That's, again, unlike some of these other diseases where you can regrow your colon cells or whatever. So the deck's stacked against us a little bit. And so when people say, why does it take so long? That's some of the reasons. But here we are now literally in this year with our first approved drug, which is fantastic. Anything?
Yeah, no, I would just say for this group, The thing that's important to me is in immunotherapies is stomping out type 1 in the next generations. And most people will say I'm the only person in my family or I'm the first person in my family. And why is that? Type 1 happens at a rate of about 4 in 1,000 people in the US. If you have type 1, our kids are as male and a female, it's about 5 in 100 risk for our kids, 3 in 100 for a female mom with type 1. The risk is higher, but it's not, as some of the psychologists would say, the glass half full is it's a 95 to 97% chance they won't get it, but it is 10 to 15 times elevated over background. So everybody in this room, your first degree relatives are 10 to 15 times more than their neighbors to get type 1. We have to stop this. Now the good news is, teplizumab to me is just the very tip of the iceberg. What we know is even these other immune therapies like for ulcerative colitis or rheumatoid arthritis, the genetics of type 1 are shared with all autoimmunity. Almost everybody in here will have other autoimmunity in their family because the genes are all focused on immune regulation that go haywire, that cause autoimmunity. And the thing that we're doing is we're actually piggybacking off a lot of this work right now. And I think, for example, one of our legendary, the person who developed teplizumab, Jeff Bluestone, he spun out of a company out of UCSF focused on type 1 diabetes, but other autoimmune diseases as well, because his technology, which is focused on regulatory T-cell work, is applicable at a higher level. So the thing that's really nice for me is 3 years is just the beginning. Like I firmly believe that as we really get these specific drugs coming along, we'll be able to very much delay the disease and preserve beta cell function. And actually a lot of this work will help multiple autoimmune diseases because the mechanisms are almost the same.
The only thing I would add is that, this drug is so great, but right now it only applies for a very small number of people. And I think the door will really open if there becomes an indication for the newly diagnosed, because right now, as an adult endocrinologist, my main role in this is just to remind my patients with all the other 20 things we have to talk about in our 20-minute visits, 2-3 times a year, that this drug exists and they should consider pros and cons of getting their kids screened, of reminding their siblings that they could be screened and offer them some resources. But if there becomes approval for the newly diagnosed, then I think that's really going to force even smaller clinical centers to get their ducks in a row and figure out how to figure out the logistics of this 14-day infusion. Because right now, I'm not seeing people really aggressively do that.
Well, I think, we're going to wrap up, but I hope you guys are at least left with an idea of there is a lot going on in all these different areas and at a pace that has really picked up, from my perspective, in the last few years to some real positive things. And like I joked before, I used to really not like doing these talks because it was like, oh, this trial didn't work and this trial almost worked, but it didn't. And now we have some positive things and stem cells, all this exciting stuff. So with that, we're going to do some announcements, but first to say thanks to our amazing panel for doing this.